coming back yet again, and that we continue the story of the early church. Now, we started off, I guess you could say, with the Book of Acts generation. And so we looked at Joseph of Arimathea, Aristobulus, Claudia, Pudens and Linus, and the people associated with them. And that's the early sort of takeoff in the church. And as I was saying a couple of weeks ago, what is quite interesting is to see the connections between what the early church was doing and what we're doing. And that we could say that early church was a revival fellowship, and that we are, that's what we like to term ourselves. And that can we find the same features in the church? Yes. And can we actually find the same conditions that the church is going through? Well, to a certain extent, yes, too. There's an expression in history. It says, history always repeats itself. It has to. No one ever listens. And that what we're going to see is that the sort of patterns that the early church was going through are the sort of patterns that the modern church, say in the last 200 years, last 300 years, has gone through. Because this series of little talks starts off about AD 30, at the time of the crucifixion of Christ, approximately that time, and Pentecost, and goes through to about 300 years later. That's the main concentration, when Constantine creates, I guess you could say, the Church Militant in the Roman Catholic Church. And then there's the launch from there. But we're going to have a little bit of a look after that, because it was very important for Ireland, what was developing in the early church. And there would come a major clash between what is loosely called the Celtic Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And that's how we're going to finish off. But today we're going to look at what's called the 10 persecutions, or the 10 great persecutions. And just to read a scripture at the start, always a good idea. In Matthew 24, when the disciples say, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" And in verse 4, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." We're very familiar with that. "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places." Very familiar with that. "All these are the beginning of sorrows." And then it says, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." Well, those verses would be very familiar with when the period of the 10 persecutions was unleashed. It would be very familiar to a lot of saints who had access to those writings at that stage. What's called the canon of the Bible, all the Gospels and the letters, etc., came together and were joined to the Old Testament. That took some time to achieve, well over 200 years to achieve that. But in the meantime, the Christian communities that we are looking at were often passing these writings around among themselves. And one, say the church at Antioch might be very familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. The church at Ephesus would be very familiar with the Gospel of Mark or Luke, and other, in 10 or 20 years, you'd find some churches had this letter of Paul and some other, and they used to pass them around each other, pass them among each other for reading. And that's why even before the Bible was brought together as what we call a canon or a collection, people were very familiar with these writings. It was a bit like a great international library, lending library between the churches. Letters were prized, the Gospels were prized and copied and subsequently brought together. But they would have been very familiar with that prophecy of the Lord. And for them, at the time of the 10 persecutions, it would have seemed very real that they were right in the middle of it. And in a sense, they were. And I'm a great believer in the prophecies in the Bible, that they're multi-leveled, that you can see them fulfilled in this particular period in history, and you can see them fulfilled in another period in history, and the same sort of thing happening. But what we get is through history is a rising intensity. And we live in an age now where, well, when I talk to you about the 10 persecutions, you're going to think, whoa, okay. Is it any better now than it was then? Is it any worse? Is it any more intense? Well, what actually happened was Claudius was the first of the 10 persecutions, the Emperor Claudius, and he didn't get into wholesale massacres or slaughters of Christians, but he decided they were a nuisance. He decided they were a nuisance, and he decided they were very much part of the Jewish community, which to a large extent they were, although they preached a different gospel, obviously. But he talked about Jews and Christians just being a nuisance. And he prided himself as being an academic. He often spent a lot of time in the libraries, and he attracted philosophers and writers, and he couldn't fit the Christians in to his imperial world. And this is one touchstone of a church that's doing the right thing. We just don't fit in. And we're tolerated, but we're not accepted. That is a keystone, when a church is tolerated but not accepted widely. I would say that indicates potentially that the church is doing the right thing. I would say today, as a revival fellowship, we're tolerated widely around the world, but not really accepted. At best, we're ignored. And then, of course, our revival doesn't go out to the nations. Our revival goes out to individuals who listen and come along. In the same way, when Jesus preached in Galilee and in Jerusalem, he wasn't trying to turn whole nations to him. He wasn't trying to turn whole communities to him. He drew out individuals, a precious, precious few. And that early church in the Claudian persecution was mainly centered on Rome. It was very active, as we heard with Claudia and Pudens and Linus last week, a very active Christian community, really standing their ground, refusing to acknowledge the emperor as divine, refusing to burn incense in his temples, refusing to honor his priests, refusing to honor the priests of any of the many, many religions, and only worshipping the Lord according to what we would call now the Bible. And they seemed to be very on song, and they suffered for it. Claudius drove them out of Rome. He also took the opportunity to drive the Jews out as well, because they wouldn't acknowledge the emperor as a god. They worshipped, Yahweh. They worshipped the God of the Old Testament, who is the same God that we worship, but they don't worship him in spirit and truth. But to the Romans, that was completely lost on them. In fact, early Roman writings about the persecution of Claudius and the persecution by Nero say that the Jews and the Christians, they followed a man called Chrestus, who was a rebel and who incited rebellion in this community. So they had a kind of a real garbled view of it, Christus meaning Christ, of course. And that was all very strange because there were Roman historians around who knew exactly who Christ was and that he had been crucified in Palestine, and that there was a story that he had risen from the dead. And that was what was all about. But Claudius wasn't interested in that. He drove them out, but he couldn't get rid of the Roman Church, as we heard last week. They just went underground. And famously, you know, they literally went underground into the catacombs. And a lot of the early church were slaves or poor free men, poor citizens. And they had it tough, but they were used to having it tough. They had to worship at night, not during the day. They couldn't meet in recognized buildings. But they were used to the tough life. And the fantastic thing is that the number of early Christians who were from noble backgrounds, like we heard last week, and very used to sort of a courtly life or a wealthy life, they took on that lifestyle too. And not only that, they used Rome as a springboard to go out and spread the gospel right across the empire. They used their connections. They used the highways of Rome, the arteries, or the transport arteries, and they used the people they knew, connections, etc., etc. So, of course, right across to Britain, the Claudian persecution didn't cause any ripple at all. The expansion of God's word kept on keeping on. And you could say that first persecution was fairly localized. Then the next one is you get Nero comes along. He's a bit of a head case, Nero. Some people say he started off all right. Some historians say he never started off all right. He was bad from the start and he just kept getting worse. Others say, oh, yeah, but it doesn't really matter. He was every man's worst ruler, in a sense. Finally assassinated by his own people. And when there was this great fire in Rome burnt down. Some people say Nero deliberately set fire to Rome in order to complete his big building project. And he certainly did rebuild Rome in quite a dramatic way. And it wasn't beyond the possibility that, he was a bit of a madman. That he'd do that, he absolutely denied it. But when the political temperature was heating up after Rome had been destroyed, he had to blame someone, a common political gambit. And the Christians were an easy target because they weren't highly organized, they weren't aggressive, they weren't militant, they preached peace. They put up with an awful lot without complaining. So he zeroed in on them, and this time the persecution really gathered pace. People were burnt alive. As I think I mentioned earlier, he just once as a kind of a stage show, really, he lit a whole street in Rome using Christians as lamps, burning as a kind of a festival display. And yes, the interesting thing that you would think is that that would kind of wipe Christianity out, that people wouldn't be, I'm not going to stay here to get killed, or perhaps I'll just go back to the old gods and save my wife and my family and my house and I'll keep my job. That didn't seem to happen. And in times of persecution, it is quite interesting that the church is strengthened, not weakened, in time of tribulation. That there were, as we'll see in the 10 persecutions, there were real efforts to stamp it out and destroy it. And it always achieved the opposite result. Sometimes there was a scattering, like they had to leave Rome and they scattered, but wherever they scattered, new churches and assemblies and fellowships sprang up. We're not really sure how Nero's persecution, how empire-wide it was, but it was certainly very dramatic. After Nero, things calmed down a bit, and there was an emperor called Vespasian who said that he persecuted the Christians, but he persecuted just about everyone. So he wasn't really zeroing in on the Christians. He was just using heavy-handed tactics to enforce his rule in Rome, because he had become emperor after a very unstable period with the death of Nero. 2 or 3 other candidates stood up and said, "I'll be emperor." There were civil wars, there's upsets. Vespasian, who was a general who actually fought in Claudius's army, you might remember last week, he was in Britain fighting alongside Aulus Claudius, and when Putin's there, Vespasian made his reputation in Britain. He was hailed by the legionaries to be the next emperor, and he's a hard man. He's a tough nut. And when he got in control, he said, "Right, I'm going to show people that I'm in control, and they won't dare get out of line." And he thumped everyone, including the Christians. And we know from the early church that, again, the church in Rome, it didn't seem to move a muscle. It survived. It kept going, and it seems to have increased. And the idea that there were Christians in Caesar's household, probably quite high up, like Claudia and Pudens, like Aristobulus, it just kept going. And what you now find is that the same ripples that were spreading out of Rome, and Rome was it was an important church. It wasn't the only church at all that was flourishing. The church in Thessalonica seemed to be doing really well. The church in Antioch, the church in Ephesus. Even though Paul lamented that a lot of the work seemed to be dying away, across the Mediterranean, it was doing really well. And I sometimes wonder if the church in Rome prospered so much because it was hit so hard in these initial persecutions. And it was a bit like if you want to turn iron into steel, you just keep heating it, cooling it, and beating it on the anvil, and it will become steel. And I think in a spiritual sense, the church in Rome began to stand out through the persecutions it had suffered. Nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church at this stage at all. That was a later title, that was a later development. It was just the church at Rome. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that if you, this historian said, if you want to find the real original church in Rome in the early centuries, you don't go to St. Peter's Basilica, the Roman Catholic Church. You go just a few blocks away with the house of Pudentiana, the daughter of Pudens and Claudia, who was martyred for preaching the gospel under the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Now, Domitian was a son of Vespasian. He was a piece of work, actually. Vespasian was just a general trying to run the empire, and he just thumped everyone. Not incessantly, but in order to achieve a result. Domitian seems to have had a real mental issue. He's very able, very intelligent. He followed his brother Titus, who had been the emperor who actually sacked Jerusalem. And you'd think Titus was a tough cookie, but Domitian, he had a giant chip on his shoulder about something. Perhaps he thought he should have ruled before his brother. but he was the first of the emperors. Although the emperors declared themselves to be semi-divine, and they had incense offered to them and all this sort of carry on, they didn't really believe it. It was a political move started by Augustus way back. Domitian seemed to believe it, and he styled himself as Lord and God of the empire. And anyone who challenged that, he was going to demonstrate that he believed he was Lord and God. And most people realized that Domitian is a very able soldier, very good general, very brave, but he had issues. And so everyone just fell in with it, including the Senate, who were a bit afraid of him. And there was some sort of story that even Domitian literally drinks the blood of his enemies. I don't think that's true, but that was the sort of reputation he had. So everyone fell into line. Yep, okay, you want to call yourself Lord and Master, or you want to call yourself Lord and God, and he inscribed it in marble, etc. Everyone else went, yeah, okay, we'll wait this guy out. The Christians said no. They didn't riot, they didn't run about the streets, but it became pretty clear that if you asked a Christian, he said, no, I'm sorry, we worship our God, the God of the Bible. Domitian got to hear about it. He said, okay, these Christians, he thumped them. And he not only thumped them in Rome, he thumped them all over the empire, wherever they could be found. And he told his governors across the empire, all the provinces were run by governors, and the governors were backed by legions and local forts, and backed by magistrates and general, highly efficient administration across the Roman Empire. He let it be known, Christians are a target. Do whatever you like to them. And you got a bit of an uneven response across the empire. So, some of the magistrates and governors were like, oh, I got enough on the plate without chasing these folks around. They don't do any harm, they're honest, they keep the law. Okay, we might imprison a few or execute a few, but we're not going to chase hard. So at one end, you had in other areas where they, fearing Domitian, they really went after the Christians. And there was also a propaganda wave that followed Domitian's persecution in order to give it some sort of weight. And the propaganda went like this, that the Christians only celebrate their God at night because they're ashamed to do it in the day. They only celebrate their God at night because they're into sorcery and they're into the dark arts. They only celebrate their God at night because they're like the bacchanals. If you heard the bacchanals, that came from ancient Greece, those people who worship the god Bacchus, they worshipped non-stop parties, wine, women in song, drunkenness, reveling, and even that was too much for the Roman taste, so they celebrated at night with all these sort of amazingly bad taste gatherings, real Sodom and Gomorrah stuff. And so Domitian had the Christians lumped in with them. Ironically, that the Christians are just like the bacchanals, and they're also cannibals. They eat the flesh of humans. Now they got that from the story in the Gospels, which you're all familiar with, when Jesus said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. This is my blood, which is shed for you, and you must, take the bread, you take the cup." So they, as in classic propaganda, they jazzed it up that the Christians were cannibals, they were sorcerers, they were dissolute, etc., etc. And that made it easy for the governors to haul them out and persecute them big style. And there were mass killings, and it was a religious war, and it was a one-sided religious war. And Domitian pretty much determined to wipe out Christianity. How amazing it is. He had all the resources at his disposal and all the determination. And people feared him, so they carried out his wishes. And it was a sustained, the heart of his persecution. There were 10 main persecutions, and the heart of these persecutions lasted for about a year. The intensity. And somehow the church survived. And some historians say, oh, well, in 300 years of the early church, there were only 10 persecutions, and it amounts to about 10 years. And that's not a big deal, is it? Well, two things. A, in those years, an awful lot of people were killed. In those years, an awful lot of homes were destroyed and broken up. In those years, an awful lot of people were scattered and their businesses gone, and they were tortured, etc. But all that year did was it put down a blueprint for the governors to follow. So when the official persecution stopped, then the governors were expected to not necessarily maintain with the same intensity, but to keep that up. If you're a governor of Bithynia, if you're a governor of Britannia, if you're a governor of Hispania, of Spain, then what the Senate and the Emperor should be hearing is that you're keeping pressure on these people. We want to know. So that although the Emperor didn't have to keep up announcing the persecutions, they seem to have kept on keeping on. Did it wipe out the church? No, it didn't. It's an awful lot of people in Rome were killed, including, as we heard, Pudentiana, as recorded by her sister. But right across the empire, places like Ireland became a safe haven. Why? Well, they're geographically a long way away from Rome. Ireland was literally right at the edge of the empire. After that, next stop, New York. And the Romans didn't seem very interested in New York. So Ireland was right on the edge. And if you wanted a breathing space and to start witnessing somewhere else, and the church did tend to scatter, like since the days of Stephen, Ireland's a good old option. And as we explained last week, it's a good trading route. It's very familiar to the people in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially the Roman traders knew about it. It had connections. It had recently become a province after Claudius captured it. Yeah, it had its problems, but it's a good place to go. And if you want to be really safe, you went from mainland Britain across to Ireland. And here we really start to see the beginning of what we would call the Celtic Church. As I said, some historians say, well, there is no real Celtic Church. It's a myth, they were just small groups of Christians in different communities, carrying on preaching the gospel and living among the people and worshipping Christ. Sounds like a church to me. And some historians, because they couldn't see a structure similar to the later church in Rome, what I call the Church Militant, that Constantine and Theodosius set up, they decided it wasn't a church at all. It was a church, all right. It was a revival fellowship, but it wasn't competitive. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't combative. It was a group of saints. There's a group of people who got together. They wanted breathing space to preach the gospel. They wanted breathing space to fellowship. They wanted breathing space to, and they were, that early church, from what we can work out, were highly literate. They soon became a centre for learning in Ireland and Northern England, which in fact the Irish Church set up new churches in Northern England and Scotland. And it was separate in that sense to the rest of what was going on in the empire. It was haven time. Did the persecution stop? No, we've got Marcus Aurelius. Now, and a lot of these guys have good reputations in the history books, and rightly so. in the secular sense, Marcus Aurelius was one of the great emperors of Rome. When the barbarians are beginning to sort of beat the war drums on the northeastern, northwestern borders of Rome, when things were of the empire way up in Europe, when things were very unstable, when there was a lot of corruption and a lot of confusion about the direction the empire should be taken, Marcus Aurelius comes in, dedicates his life to the empire. You know, saw him a bit in the film Gladiator, didn't you? That sort of guy. Well, he's a bit of a two-sided guy, because although being called the philosopher emperor and a man of learning and a man of reason and a man of statesman-like qualities, the Christians just got under his skin. He really annoyed him because they wouldn't agree with him. They wouldn't honor him as a man who could teach them about what life was all about. In fact, they seem to say the opposite to what he said. He said, for example, famously, I noticed they put it on the wall in Bath, at our Bath camp, the school, because, you know, it's kind of an academic thing to say. Marcus Aurelius famously said, there is no such thing as a fact, only opinion. Well, the Christians had a problem with that straight away. And he didn't like that one little bit. And he said, you know, I'll leave you alone as long as you agree to accept all gods. And I'll leave you alone as long as you accept to agree that I'm semi-divine. And then we get on with the business of ruling Rome together and being happy citizens together, and the Pax Romana, and the dream can continue. And everyone but the Christians said, yay. Well, the Christians and the Jews. And the Christians and the Jews said, no. Sorry, you got that one wrong, mate. He pounded the Christians. Same thing as Domitian. He wasn't as psychopathic or sociopathic as Domitian. But boy, he had clout, and he was a general, and he hit the Christian community again and again and again. And when he finally died, the Christian community was as strong as ever it had been. It had flourished. And the communities, if we're looking in the Isles to the north and west, they were just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you think now that we might come into calmer waters, well, sometimes it did happen. Sometimes there was a bit of a pause, and, you know, emperors would have better things to do than to worry about these Christians. But you've got a succession of emperors now, like Trajan, Decius, Valerian, Maximian. On and on it went towards the worst of the bunch, Diocletian. They couldn't get the Christians out of their head. Sound familiar? No, I really believe that when you witness to someone on the street and they reject you and reject everything that you said and get angry and walk away, they won't forget. They won't forget. That's the word of God. That's a royal priest, a spirit-filled person telling you what's in the Bible and what you must do to be saved. And you rejected it, but boy, you ain't going to forget it. And what you have in the Roman Empire is a multiplicity of religions and temples and gods. It was a major of the capital economy of the Roman Empire. Religion was a hugely important part for all the temples and priests and priestesses and all the donations and all the sacrifices and everything. You see that little picture of that in Ephesus. You know, Ephesus was a great center for the worship of the goddess Diana. Huge multi-million equivalent turnovers there. So the empire was religion unchained. You know, you could have a God for anything you like, as Paul said when he was on Mars Hill. You even have the unknown God. Oh, that's the one I'll talk about. But the Christians stood out. They always stood out because they rejected that whole circus. They wouldn't play safe. And there were mighty men of valor, if you like, who were emperors, like Trajan, like Marcus Aurelius, and then like the great Septimus Severus who comes along in the very early 3rd century AD, who tried to wipe them out with bitter, intense persecutions that now are becoming empire-wide, not just local, and that they would hit an area really hard and then say for about a year and then say to the governors, that's the law. That's what I want you guys to sort. Don't let me down. And then they get on with what they were doing, which was a huge job, you know, and a lot of them, guys like Septimus Severus, for example, man, if you look at their secular record, they were great road builders and bridge builders and built cities and drove back hordes of invaders and established the law. They were busy men. But they'd take time off because the Christians got under their skin. And I believe to a certain extent that's the secret of our success in modern times. We get under people's skin. We don't go deliberately annoying the authorities. We don't go demonstrating in the street and looking for a fight. Christian church, early Christian church, exactly the same. But we just keep on preaching what we believe, and we refuse to join in with mainstream religion. Exactly in the first 200 or 300 years of the early church, they refused to join in. And if you go to Ireland again at this time, it was working incredibly well because the early church in Ireland at this stage, they weren't so much bumping into governors who had writs and imperial warrants for the persecution of Christians and their arrest and all their property confiscated. They were bumping into pretty stubborn paganism. The word pagan actually comes from pagani, paganus pagani, the Latin, it means of the countryside. And by the time you get into these big outlying country areas, or where there are not many towns and villages, but a lot of farmland, right across Europe and in Ireland, you get a lot of animist worship, worshipping the stones, worshipping the trees, worshipping the rivers, worshipping the pixies, worshipping trolls, goblins, all sorts going on. And the early Christians had to take that on. And the great thing about the Celtic church, they had to be careful. They didn't go in with a sword and a flail and say, right, we're going to wipe you guys out if you don't believe. They went in gently among them. And they learned their language and they learned their custom. And they, bit by bit, when you read about these guys, they were remarkable and was producing generations of them. They weren't big communities. They seemed to deliberately keep themselves small. They were like squads of Christians, small fellowships, and living among the locals and getting to know them and not thundering against their beliefs, but putting their gospel up against the pagan gospel and seeing which one would stand. And the Irish church was doing well. Oh yeah, they knew how to do that. Some chroniclers report that there was always a risk, and it was going to be a chronic risk that they had to be aware of, that in order to get along, sometimes they'd end up adopting certain pagan principles and adopting pagan customs, almost by default or by habit, or deliberately thinking, well, if we do this, then they'll much more likely listen to the gospel. That was the only risk. But in Ireland, there wasn't an overt bloodletting by the imperial authorities. It was right over there somewhere. But they were doing very well among the pagan communities and converting a lot of people. And that spread to the north of England, and it spread to Scotland. And that's when later you hear of these giants like Columba and Aidan, Irish monk who went to Scotland. And then even later you get, now there's a bit of debate about Patrick, you know, the Scot, captured by Irish pirates, brought up in Ireland, goes back to Scotland, comes back to Ireland. Good number of historians say it's a bit cheeky of the Roman Catholic system to adopt him, that he was really Celtic Christian. I don't know, but he was that similar approach working among people. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we'll see already in these early 1st, 2nd, early 3rd century, the Irish church and the church in mainland Britannia had developed this idea of, this is pretty safe territory. We just work with the people gently, keep on keeping on with the gospel. It didn't mean that the Roman authorities wouldn't come down on you if they caught you. Early martyrs caught Alban, the Roman soldier who converted in Britain and was executed for sheltering a priest. Aristobulus was martyred in Britain. Simon Zelotes was martyred in Britain. It was still going on, but not with the same intensity. But the gospel was flourishing. And just, can't go on too long, just as a bit of an aside, to give you an idea of the sort of ways that the authorities were dealing in the early church in the 1st and 2nd and early 3rd century AD, trying to root this church out, is the story of Perpetua, a young girl. She was killed in the arena by a gladiator when she was 21 and recently married and with a newborn baby. And her story tells a lot about the attitude of the early church to persecution, and a lot of the attitude of the early church to the gospel and their resilience. She was, and I think similar things were happening, say, in Britannia, and similar things happening in Gaul, and to a lesser extent, perhaps in Ireland. But she was born in North Africa, in the province of Libya. And she came from a very well-to-do family. Libya was a very Romanized province, a very important part of the empire. And Perpetua, we're pretty sure she heard the gospel from the slave community, because most people in Roman society were slaves. And there was a slave girl called Feliciana. Anyway, it seems that, we're not 100% sure, that Feliciana or one of her other slaves had preached the gospel to Perpetua, who was her mistress. And Perpetua was so impressed by that, she listened to what was said. She decided to become a Christian. She knew how dangerous it would be, because she was living at the time of the Emperor Septimus Severus, and that Christianity had been outlawed. And she showed immense courage. She decided no, and she asked to get baptized. And the BBC did a documentary on her recently, and I thought, this will be interesting. They might fudge this one. And it was a remarkable documentary, because we know a lot about Perpetua from what appears to be a journal written by her, because she was a well-educated woman, and written by letters and court accounts, because when she was arrested for being a Christian, it really lit up the province, because the family was well known. It was assumed that Christians, for the most part, were slaves or poverty-stricken people or renegades or runaways. But for a noblewoman of a family of renown to become a Christian, despite what the emperor said, that really stirred the dust. So we know a lot about her. And when you read the evidence about Perpetua, it's pretty clear she was a gospel Christian. She received the Holy Spirit. She spoke in tongues, and she asked to be baptized. And before she could get baptized, she got arrested. And because the governor of the town, he was trying to curry favor with Septimus Severus. So he thought, what I will do, because I think it's Septimus's birthday coming up, I will announce a particularly harsh persecution of Christians on the birthday of the emperor, and he'll be so pleased with me. So interestingly, it wasn't Septimus who ordered this, but it shows that the climate that encouraged the persecutions, that the governor decided to do it to impress the emperor. He had Perpetua arrested, along with Felicitiana, and along with another slave, and the people were out in the streets looking for any other Christians because they wanted a big show in the amphitheater in this North African town to get to the ears of the emperor. You know, we on your birthday, emperor, happy birthday. We killed a whole lot of Christians for you. And they went really nasty deaths. Fantastic. So that was all happening. But what they had, which is really interesting, and the Emperor Trajan had also advised this when he was persecuting Christians. He said, give them a chance to get off the hook. Give them a chance to recant, as we would say. Give them a chance to burn incense to me. Give them a chance to make a temple offering to another god. And then if they do that, reward them. If they do that, put blessings on them. And the Romans are very good at encouraging Christians to recant. And they called them the traditores. That is the expression in Latin. It means those who hand over. And we get the word traitor from it, because as part of your, say you were threatened with being burnt alive or fed to wild dogs or torn apart by horses or something, and you recanted. You said, no, I'll do this, whatever you like. They said, well, part of the deal, yeah, that's great, we just want you to give a few names of some other Christians so that they can get the same opportunity as you've got to recant, and that you can enjoy that you've saved them as well. And those who did pass on the names of other Christian households and other Christians were called the traditores, those who pass on information. And there were some. It did happen. And they said to Perpetua, here's your opportunity. You're a young married Roman matron of a wealthy family and well-to-do. Look, we won't even ask you to make a public declaration supporting the emperor as a god. We won't even ask you to go into a temple and make sacrifice to a local god. All we'll ask you to do is burn some incense, and you don't have to say anything. We will say that is for a god, and then you're off the hook. And her father was pleading with her and her relatives, and she would not. She said, I only worship one God, and my prayers go up to one God like incense, and that is the God of Christus. That is the God of Christ. That is Christ. And she talked like this, and it drove them mad. And she said, I only have one request of you, and that is that I get baptized. And they thought, is this woman gone completely mad? And they brought in person after person to plead with her. And then the governor said, look, you know, this is going very badly. What's the emperor going to think if we're all falling about because of one woman? And he said, you're going to be killed tomorrow. And we're going to kill Felicitiana tomorrow. We're going to kill some other slaves. And that's it. Game over. And she was thrown into prison with her newborn child. And we do have an amazing record of the night she spent in prison with those others, with the slaves. And that it is said, people who wrote down what was going on, that she sat up all night encouraging them, praying with them, talking about the gospel, talking about what they were doing. And in the morning, she actually had a final request. And it is said that her whole conduct so softened the heart of the jailers, her dignity and her gentleness of spirit, they agreed she be baptized. And she was baptized, and she was just delighted. And they couldn't work out why she was so delighted, because they were going to send her into the arena. And she went into the arena with the other slaves, and again encouraging them. She's only 21, you know, young mum. And the mob was shouting and baying for blood, and, you know, this is going to be great. We come for to watch your bloodletting here. And the gladiators were lined up, and the idea was that a gladiator would choose a victim and fight them. Well, soon there was just Perpetua left there, and the gladiator was assigned to kill her, and he couldn't do it. He was looking at a saint. He's looking at someone who was just filled with the Spirit of God and got baptized and come through the night. And he actually broke down, and he said, and she said, because she was quite right, if you don't kill me, they will kill you. And she said, I'll make it easy for you, kill me, and you are doing what your emperor tells you to do, and I will stand here as my emperor tells me to do. And he struck her down. And apparently in the arena, there was just this, after all the baying for blood and cheering, and this is great, and we're watching Christians getting killed, she died as such a living testimony that it just struck the crowd to silence. What have we done? That is the sort of impact that Christianity was having in the Roman Empire. Despite the persecutions, and it was personal witness, individual testimony, faithful little groups like in the Isles to the north and west, faithful little groups like in Hispania and Gaul and Germania and Italia, and faithful little groups back in Bithynia and around Antioch and down in Palestina, as they called it. Individuals just holding their ground. Tiny little communities. Not highly organized churches, not institutions with layers and bishops and deacons and archdeacons and reverends and right reverends and acolytes and all. No, just little communities of people like Perpetua, just holding their ground. Roman Catholics adopted Perpetua as a saint hundreds of years later. The cheek of them. She had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. But they gobbled up that story and said one of ours. And so next week, run out of time. Yep, next week, we'll finish off the great persecutions, which we'll just look at Diocletian. Along comes Constantine, and then we'll see when things really start getting tough for the early church. Really, really tough for the early church. When you think they thought they'd come out of the 10 persecutions, then something hit them, which amazingly spiritually was much, much worse. But I'll leave it there and hand over to Anthony. Thanks, Anthony.